Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. Today I'm going to show you how I painted this realistic and fun watercolour portrait and share with you some tips I have that will hopefully help you to create some beautiful watercolour portrait paintings of your own. I do have a video on my channel where I gave you my first 5 tips for watercolour portraits, and if you haven't seen that I'll leave a link to it in the card above and in the description box below, along with a list of all my materials and the reference photo for today's painting. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video. In my last video for watercolour portraits, I talked about how important it was to choose the right paper and get an accurate outline sketch, and this is really key, especially if you're aiming for realism. But even before you draw out your outline sketch, my first tip for today is to choose a good reference photo to work from, as without a good reference image, your painting process will likely be a lot harder from the start. I mainly use Pixabay for my reference images, as they have a huge range of copyright and royalty-free quality images to choose from, but there are other sites out there that will offer the same, or of course you can take your own reference photos. But whatever source you use, there are a few things to look out for. Obviously, to start with, the photo needs to be in focus, clear and have good resolution, but I also like to look for an image that has a good level of contrast, maybe some interesting shadows and lighting, and is one that has personality and inspires me to paint. Once I find a reference image I'm happy with, I can then draw out an accurate outline sketch and transfer it to my watercolour paper. With this done, my second tip is to then secure your watercolour paper down to your table or board using tape. If you are painting on a watercolour block of paper, you won't need to do this, but if not, securing your paper with tape will minimise the chance of it buckling or warping when you add water. I prefer to tape my paper to a board rather than my table, as it allows me more flexibility to turn or tilt my paper as I'm painting, but do whatever works for you. A lot of people ask me which tape I use, and I have a few different washi tapes which are fine for my sketchbook paintings, but if I'm doing a larger painting like this, I'll often use 2 tapes. The first is the Scotch Magic Tape, which I use to get a nice border around the edge of my painting. And the second is this green frog tape, which is a lot wider and stronger, and really keeps my watercolour paper secure on the board. Both of these tapes are also quite easy to remove and don't rip or damage my paper, but that may depend on which paper you're using, so do try it out first. Okay, so I've chosen my reference image, drawn out an accurate outline sketch and taped it securely to my board. So what's next? Well, in my last portrait video I talked about the importance of studying your reference image before you start painting. And I've printed a smaller copy of today's photo out of my computer as I find it helpful. I mentioned looking at the different tonal values within the face and whether the colour transitions between them are hard or soft. But tip 3 is to also think about what style you're aiming for, as well as what watercolour techniques you might use in your painting to achieve the look you're going for. So with this portrait, I thought about whether I was going to go for a more traditional and realistic style, or maybe try something looser and more expressive, or perhaps even a combination of both. I decided to do a more traditional and realistic face, but experiment a bit with a looser style of painting for the hair. And with a clearer idea in my mind of what style I was aiming for and what techniques I might use to achieve them, I could then pre-mix my watercolours. This I like to do before I start, so I don't have to worry about wasting time on that in the middle of painting. I'm going to paint the skin first, so I mixed up a light, mid and dark tone for the first layers of the skin, and again referred back to my reference photo as a guide. I'm using burnt sienna for the lightest tones, burnt umber for the mid-tones, and a mix of sepia with a bit of Payne's grey and burnt umber for the darker tones. I also mixed together a bit of cadmium red light with some burnt umber for the colour on her cheeks. Now at last it's time to start painting, and tip number 4 is just a quick one about brushes, and more specifically using the right sized brush for the area that you're painting. Now you don't need to have a lot of brushes, and they don't have to be super expensive either, but it is helpful to have maybe 2. one larger brush to more quickly and efficiently paint larger areas of the skin and hair, and a smaller one to allow you to accurately paint the smaller details of the eyes, nose and mouth. For today's portrait, I've chosen two round silver black velvet brushes as they hold a good amount of water and can keep a nice fine point. These are in a size 12 and a size 8, but use whatever you have at home. I'm going to start with a size 12 brush to paint the lightest skin tones I can see from my reference image. I'm going to be using the wet and wet technique to achieve a nice even skin tone without any hard edges, so I begin by pre-wetting my paper with clean water before adding any paint. One of my tips from the previous portrait painting was to work in layers and build up your skin tones gradually, and I'll be using those same techniques for this portrait. But in order to do this successfully, you need to have a bit of an understanding about arguably the two most important things when painting in watercolour, and that is water control and timing. So before I give you tip number 5, I'm going to show you a bit of the process of this portrait to illustrate what I mean. As I said, I'm using the wet in wet technique to apply my first layer of watercolour to the face. So I pre-wet my paper with clean water all over the face and neck area. I'm going to leave the hair for now as I'll paint that later. So this isn't difficult, but if you're working on a large area or painting in a warm room, you may find that some parts of the paper start to dry before others, which you don't want. To get an even smooth skin tone, you need to start with evenly wet paper. You don't want puddles of water, more uneven sheen across the surface of the paper, like you can sort of see here. Sometimes I'll even add a second layer of water once the first has soaked in a bit, which means the paper will stay wetter for longer and give me a bit more time to paint. Once the paper is evenly wet, I can then start to drop in some of the burnt sienna, which is the lightest of the 3 skin tones that I mixed up at the start. I want to try and do this quite loosely and quickly, so the larger size 12 brush really helps. I can also start to add some of the mid-tone skin colour too, and because the surface of my paper is still wet, the paint spreads and bleeds across it really nicely. I add this burnt umber mid-tone to the slightly darker areas on the face that are in shadow. At this point though, my paper had started to dry, and this is where things can get a bit tricky, as adding more watery paint to the surface of the paper now would likely push the drying watercolour across the paper and create a watercolour bloom, which you probably don't want. So here is an example of when timing is really important. You need to know when to stop, leave it to dry completely, and then you can re-wet the skin again to add your next layer. And that's what I did here. It can take a fair bit of practice before knowing when to stop becomes instinctive, and I'm still working on it myself. So as far as the wet in wet technique goes at least, my tip number 5 is, if in doubt, dry it out. That way you're less likely to take chances that might spoil your painting. And if by the way you haven't got time to wait for your paper to dry naturally, then you can always use a heat tool or a hairdryer on a low setting. But if you follow this tip, you can continue to add further layers until you've built up to the skin tone you want. After my first few layers have dried though, I also like to start putting in some of the darkest values into the painting to add in a bit of contrast and help me gauge how much I need to adjust the skin tones for it to be accurate. For this I want more precise lines, so I paint onto dry paper with the smaller of my 2 brushes. For the small lines around her face here, I realised I needed to go a lot darker, but rather than wet the whole of the skin again, I painted onto dry paper and softened any hard paint edges out with a clean damp brush. The layering process can take some time, but once I'd started to build up to a more realistic and natural skin tone, any last adjustments could be done with transparent glazes of colour applied onto dry paper again. Here I'm using a bit more concentrated burnt sienna to add back in some warmer hues to her skin. And here I'm adding a bit more burnt umber. With the skin completely dry once more, I've finally felt happy enough with it to move on to the eyes and other facial features. Painting in the eyes is the part I love the most and really helps bring the painting to life. I use the wet on dry technique again here, where water control and timing are not really something you have to worry about, especially on such a small area like this. With less water you get more precision and control, and it's really great for adding in sharp lines and details so you can relax and take your time. I started off with a very light wash of ultramarine blue, and then used a mixture of Payne's grey and neutral tint for the pupil and the eyelids and so on. I'm still using the size 8 brush here, but I'm using it on the very tip to paint in the small details and to paint around the highlights in each eye to help them look really bright. For the eyebrows I used the same Payne's grey and neutral tint mix, but this time I used the dry brush technique to give a more natural and textured look. So I dried off my brush on a tissue before applying the paint to dry paper. This is a really easy and effective way to quickly paint in eyebrows, or any facial hair for that matter. Moving my attentions onto the mouth next, and again I used the wet on dry technique as I needed precision and control here. I also wanted to be able to paint this part quite slowly and build up light layers gradually, as I haven't had much practice with painting an open mouth before and wanted to get it right. And that brings me on to the first of my bonus tips for watercolour portraits. It can be all too tempting to avoid having to paint the parts that you're not comfortable or confident with. You may even decide to choose an alternative reference image to avoid it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in doing so you are never going to learn new skills and improve as an artist. So my tip is to isolate these areas and practice the features that you want to improve on, simply by doing some small studies either in your sketchbook or on a scrap piece of watercolour paper. You don't have to paint a whole portrait each time, just practice painting mouths, teeth, noses or eyes for example. And by doing this, you will begin to improve your water control, timing and techniques on a smaller scale, and gradually you'll build your confidence and skills ready for a full portrait. I did wonder whether doing some smaller sketchbook studies like this of different facial features might be something you'd like to see me do on my channel here. So let me know by leaving a comment in the box below, along with the facial feature you'd like me to demonstrate, as it will be good practice for me too. Onto the hair next, and this is where I decided to use a looser style of watercolour painting, so it was back to the wet in wet technique. Painting each and every curl in a more realistic style would have taken me ages, so I was really excited to try something a bit different, and my bonus tip number 2 is not to be afraid to do just that. Experiment. I went back to my larger size 12 brush to apply a mixture of neutral tint and Payne's grey to the wet paper, and just used wiggly lines to suggest curls rather than painstakingly paint each and every one. And it was a lot of fun, and despite needing to apply a few layers to build up the impression of depth and volume, it was a very quick and easy way to paint what could have taken hours. Watercolour is such a versatile medium, and that's a big part of why I love it so much. It also has the flexibility once dry that you can add other media over the top, which is really useful if you want to refine some of the facial features, perhaps add in more texture for example, or even hide any of those happy little accidents. So my final bonus tip is to consider mixing your media. You can add coloured pencil detail over the top like I did, pastel pencils or even gel pens. It's up to you, so keep an open mind and enjoy it. I'm really pleased with how this one turned out, and I had a lot of fun combining the more realistic facial features with a looser, more expressive style for the hair. But let me know what you think. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, comment and subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you all so much for watching, take care, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!